silently in the background. But we are recording, and it's great that we're recording, because I know so many people might not get to tune in now, but they will tune in and watch it on their own time, in a space that feels safe for them. And I know that you appreciate that. I heard you say that at the recent forum you hosted around racial justice. And that is the thing I think that I so appreciate about you, that the recognition that all injustice is related, and inequality and oppression are at the roots of this. And when, of course, all of us are much more passionate about forms of oppression that impact us, but we need to be cognizant of all of it, right? And as you said, the coalition building piece of needing to come together. I do feel like trauma, I've recognized a social force that is trauma in ways I never have before. It divides us, it sends us to our separate corners to lick our wounds, and we don't come together and address it collectively.
Yeah, and not to start with like a sinister note, but I feel like a lot of trauma is really architected by systems as a way to marginalize and oppress and keep us divided and separated. And that's one of the things that we're going to explore today in addressing the gender binary, is these constructs that have allowed or disallowed people access to opportunity because of how people fit or do not fit into those confines. So not to open with this big like bum, but acknowledging that trauma is often used as a tool of the oppressors to, separate, divide, and, defeat or diminish our capacity to engage in the work that you and I are both very passionate about. And I know that so many people here are as well. It's like, how do we continue to fight past our capacity to do this work when we're also navigating like the challenges and the demons that are thrown at us through all of these systems, right?
That is so well put. And it's not really it is a because it's really right where I've come to myself with doing these trainings again and again. People that have, brought material that conducted trainings have taken the dive into how the systems were intentionally set up to be exclusive, to only be for some, at the expense of others. And that, I think that has really, the next one is going to be the trauma of unseen patterns, because right in trauma, one of the big things is this idea of the repetition compulsion, that you just keep repeating these same things until you don't, like, until you look at it, till you reflect, till you see that you're on this hamster wheel, right? And I'm so fearful that we're going to stay in the hamster wheel of society that we already had, when we know how harmful this is. Absolutely. I have to say, by way of introduction and my opportunity to soapbox, this form of oppression was the first one I was acutely aware of. Growing up in high school, my closest friend was a gay man and was out in high school. And the shock and horror of how many adults colluded in bullying, oppression, physical abuse, even, and teachers would look the other way or not address it. That was a real clear message to me and to him and to everyone who saw it, about social norms and about fitting in. And I have seen that do so much harm to people in so many ways, right? My sort of personal trauma stuff around, women's issues, right? And these are all the same. One of my, I'm glad that Brad is here, because Brad hears my soapbox all the time about the harm we do to men by having feminized emotions, right? Like, so men are not allowed to have the full range of emotions that women are allowed to have, because their man card becomes in question if they do. And so I feel like it's always so important for men to, kind of be out there talking about the fact that men have feelings. They do, I know. And just the harm we do when we really need people to fit in any sort of box is, to me, it's not okay when these systems are harming people in our public name and as public good. And we are obligated as citizens to point out and show the ways in which these systems are harming people. And if they're harming them intentionally, it's revolution time. If they're harming them unintentionally, we need to make some dramatic changes. And Josh is such great validation for sort of looking at how the gender binary harms us. The ability to sort of think big picture, to see things differently, to be outside of the box is exactly what we need. That's the heart of creativity. That's so much important stuff. And to think that we are, really stifling and keeping people from their full potential because of really bizarre social contracts that we've created. And we've even infused morality into these social contracts. And boy, does that hurt people. So I will stop talking because I'm so grateful to be able to give you the floor. And I know people are really interested and excited to hear about your experiences with this and sort of what it takes to not get stuck in that box, what you give up, what you lose, and what you gain. So, and I think Josh has said, questions in the chat are good. And if people are willing and you would introduce yourself, that's amazing in the chat. And yeah, we'll get started and I'll be quiet. I really will.
Well, thank you so much, Amy, and thank you everybody for being here. It's great to see many familiar and some unfamiliar faces in the participant list. I'm so grateful to Amy for welcoming me to participate in one of these Trauma Training Tuesdays, and I'm hoping to be able to impart some of whatever wisdom I've amassed over my years of doing work related to this, as well as really just sharing some of my own personal story. I'm a big believer in the power of storytelling and narrative as a way to facilitate learning and help to see our similarities and differences in individuals as we kind of navigate these topics that can be challenging. They can be, bring back feelings of harm and hurt. And so I want to be really sensitive to that as we dive into our next, hour or so together. So before we dive in, I'd like to establish some kind of shared definitions and also present some concepts to the group as we kind of dive in today. So we're going to be talking about the gender binary, a lot of which through the specific lens of my personal story today. But before I talk about the gender binary and what that is and other terms that are important to fully engage with my story, I'd like to make a few acknowledgements for this space that we have today. I'm a facilitator by training, so I can never really take that hat totally off. So I just want to set a few acknowledgements. The first being, I don't represent or claim to know the experiences of my other non-binary siblings. I speak for myself and want to underscore that no individual speaking about their own experience represents the whole group of that is unique and intersectional experiences that others have who also identify within that group. I do identify as queer non-binary. I should probably introduce myself a little bit more formally. My name is Joshua Croke. I use they, them pronouns. I'm the founder of Action by Design, which is a social innovation and change agency that's based here in Worcester. I'm also the president and co-founder of Love Your Labels, which is a nonprofit organization supporting LGBTQ plus youth in our community, as well as working with organizations and families to create inclusive and loving space everywhere, which I'll talk a little bit about in a bit. But That's a quick overview of who I am. I also want to give a quick content warning that I will be discussing topics of depression, self-harm, and suicide today. And if at any time anyone feels they need to go off camera or take a moment, I welcome you to do that if it's what you need. However, I also invite folks to breathe into emotions today and share the space together in vulnerability. To be emotional is a show of strength and not weakness, which, as we're talking about dismantling social structures that are harmful, I believe that is one that is very strongly permeates, especially professionalism culture, the lack of ability to really show emotion for fear that kind of weakens us in some way. So I do encourage folks to lean in and ask questions. I welcome folks if folks want to come on camera. It's great to see people, and also feel free to throw things in the chat. I just noticed, Amy, thank you for the shout out of the podcast. Our podcast is called Public Hearing, and it explores things that the public is talking about that the city and other folks should be thinking about listening into. We explore things from juvenile justice system to public education to all sorts of things in and outside of city life and, personal connection and community development. So follow that at publichearing.co. So following my talk today, I'm hoping that this can be more of a dialogue. So a space where folks can feel they can ask questions that you may feel uncomfortable asking elsewhere. We're talking about the gender binary, and just by the nature of that, it also connects to sexuality and sexual orientation and identity just more broadly. So I want to welcome and encourage folks to ask questions today. And I want to note, again, facilitator brain, that I'm inviting these questions, and I encourage folks to be sensitive to how you approach others in your life around these issues in your day-to-day lives. It shouldn't be assumed that you can ask folks in a marginalized group questions to support your own learning and that they owe you a response. So, responding to questions about our existence in the world can be overwhelming, re-traumatizing, and simply just exhausting, or simply something that we don't have time for in that moment. So I just want to make that acknowledgement as well. And also in this work, when we're talking about social justice, we are responsible for our own learning. There isn't a ton that I'm going to say today that related to definitions, terms, and considerations that one cannot find on Google, but my personal story is something I hope can resonate and support some of the learning here today. And as we open dialogue and invite questions, and we're on Facebook Live, and this is going to be recorded, it's always my intention to set as safe a space as possible, but I also want to acknowledge that safe spaces is pretty popular term today, but I don't believe that establishing a truly safe space is totally possible, especially in a gathering where different levels of relationship and familiarity exist. So I'd like to start, before I jump in, by reading an untitled poem by Beth Strano to introduce our intention for today when we engage in the dialogue section. There is no such thing as a safe space. We exist in the real world. We all carry scars and have caused wounds. This space seeks to turn down the volume of the outside world and amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. This space will not be perfect. It will not always be what we wish it to be, but it will be our space together, and we will work on it side by side. I always like to start any meetings or facilitations that I run with that poem, just to set the intention of, we might fumble through the questions that we ask. We might not know whether they're appropriate or not, but in this space today, as one of learning, I encourage folks to kind of lean into some of the discomfort of asking questions and exploring things that you might have always wanted to learn, but felt too afraid to ask. I am here opening myself up to those conversations and welcoming those in this space. So let's dive in. So I want to start with a statistic that I want to ask everyone to hold with you as we go through our time today. Just one affirming adult in the life of an LGBTQ plus young person reduces their likelihood of attempting suicide by 40%. That's a stat from an organization, the Trevor Project, which specifically works on addressing suicide and harmful behaviors in the lives of LGBTQ plus youth. It's something that is a guiding kind of course for me in the work that I do, to remember that the way that we show up for our young people and for really anybody in the world has an impact. And that could be from a, hey, I like what you're wearing today, to a thoughtful conversation navigating, the trauma that someone has experienced in their lives has a profoundly significant impact in ways that we might not know ever or years later, etc. So again, not knowing everybody in this space and the varying levels of understanding related to LGBTQ plus identity, I want to talk briefly and go over kind of a defining trans and non-binary 101. This is going to be relatively brief. So again, if you have questions, please feel free to ask, and we can explore that when I wrap up today. But again, this is also a great opportunity space to say, oh, I'm not really familiar with what that is. Google it on your keyboard, opportunity to read more about some of these things. And I'll share some resources with Amy following this that we can get shared out to folks in this space today. So when I talk about sex, like biological sex, I'm referring to physical or physiological differences between male, female, and intersex bodies, including, that includes primary sex characteristics like the reproductive system, and also secondary sex characteristics such as breast, facial hair, etc. Many people confuse biological sex and gender. We're going to spend most of our time discussing gender today, but I wanted to make sure to reference biological sex because, as you might have noticed, there are not just two, and frequently biological sex is used as an argument when discussing gender. When I talk about transgender folks, frequently shortened to trans folks, are people whose gender identity is different from the gender they were thought to be at birth. And so this, just a couple things there. And again, this is a very rapid fire overview of some of these terms, but there is no one way to be trans. There is not a right or a wrong way. It is a fluid, incredible spectrum of identity that people navigate and identify. Some people pursue medical procedure to make their bodies more congruent to their gender identity, while others don't. And just as a hopefully obvious disclaimer, it is not okay to inquire about someone's physical body just because you're interested in knowing. Non-binary or genderqueer folks don't identify within the male or female spectrum space and choose and identify with a gender identity and occupy a place in or outside of the spectrum in between those spaces. So let's talk about gender. Gender is a social construct, meaning what I mean by that is it's been used to define how people should be placed in society, how they should act, what they should wear, what they do and do not deserve access to here in America, for an example since its founding. And I want to also underscore that a binary gender system has not been how it's done since the beginning, which is also something that frequently comes in to the argument here. And so to break up my talking for a few minutes and to articulate this in a much more elegant way, I'd like us to watch this about 5-minute video on two-spirit identity. And then we'll continue kind of our journey around gender. So I'm going to share my screen briefly and let me know if this works. All right, folks, see my screen? No? All right, let's try this again.
I could see your screen. It just said you were screen sharing.
Okay.
But it was just a blank screen. So if you were expecting the video to be up, it's not, but we can see your screen.
Okay, so you
there you
not
go. Okay, now we can. There we go. Okay. Yay.
Amy, let me know with like a audio note or if you can hear the video when I click play.
All right, let me just read it really quick.
I can. We're
Great.
good.
One more time. Though the label has only been used since the 90s, the concept of the Two-Spirit is something Indigenous groups have identified with for centuries. But what does Two-Spirit actually mean, and where does it come from? So what is Two-Spirit? It's an umbrella term that bridges Indigenous and Western understandings of gender and sexuality. You may recognize it as the two that sometimes appears on the end of LGBTQ2. There are many definitions and understandings of Two-Spirit, and each is nation-specific. The term was intentionally introduced by Native people with the goal of finding common ground and helping educate about traditional teachings in a contemporary context. The Two-Spirit Society of Denver offers the following definition. Two-Spirit refers to another gender role believed to be common among most, if not all, First Peoples of Turtle Island, North America, one that had a proper and accepted place within Native societies. This acceptance was rooted in the spiritual teachings that say all life is sacred. So how did the term Two-Spirit first come about? In 1990, in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, at the 3rd Annual Native American Gay and Lesbian Gathering, the term Two-Spirit was proposed and affirmed by consensus. The word was a potential solution to what Native scholars and activists called the problem of naming, or making the many different sexual and gender identities that fall under the Two-Spirit umbrella legible across Native and non-Native cultures alike. For example, to illustrate the diversity of meanings that Two-Spirit contains, consider the following. In Lakota, the word winkte means to be as a woman and refers to two-souled Lakota people who transgress boundaries of gender from what may be considered male to female. In Dene, nadlehe means those who transform and refers to one of 4 separate genders: masculine-feminine, masculine-masculine, feminine-masculine, and feminine-feminine. Each gender has its own word in the Dene language. And those are just 2 nation-specific examples. There are so many more. Each nation's understanding of gender and sexual diversity is different and grounded in specific spiritual beliefs. Although all nations don't have a concept of Two-Spirit people, across those Indigenous nations that do, Two-Spirit people were historically held in high regard and often considered sacred or divine, holding important positions like matchmakers, medicine people, or warriors on the front lines of battle. Many Two-Spirit people perform roles traditionally assigned to both men and women. Witwa, a famous Two-Spirit of the Zuni or Ihamana, was known to take part in masculine tribal matters and feminine tribal matters, and was even sent as an official Zuni delegate to Washington, D.C. Part of the reason Two-Spirit was adopted at the 1990 conference was because much of the written record on the indigenous nations of North America begins with European contact. For instance, the writings of Jesuit priests from the 1600s contain references to berdaches, which means kept boy in French, to refer to those who embodied both male and female genders. These writings often focus negatively on perceived cross-dressing among the Anishinaabe. The term is not only inaccurate in that it projects a European understanding of gender, but is widely considered pejorative by natives. Two-Spirit was an attempt at self-determination across linguistic barriers, because the existing language, foreign and imposed violently on the indigenous peoples of North America, was both offensive and deeply colonial in its gaze. European colonizers imposed homophobia, rigid binary gender roles, and misogyny under the guise of civilizing indigenous people through the Christian tradition in residential schools and beyond. As a result, indigenous people were robbed not only of their land, but of their spiritual traditions and way of life regarding Two-Spirit people. Many nations came to forbid and punish Two-Spirit unions and self-expression. As recently as 2004, Kathy Reynolds and Dawn McKinley, 2 Cherokee women in Tulsa, Oklahoma, attempted to marry under tribal law, setting off a convoluted legal battle with serious political and social implications. The 2 were thrust into the spotlight against their wishes and became instant public symbols of the battle for Two-Spirit rights under tribal law. The Cherokee tribe is the 2nd largest in the U.S. Although they were granted the right to marry, the decision to issue them a marriage license was soon challenged and led to a tribal law declaring that a union was to be between a man and a woman. Eventually, in 2016, the law was overturned. By that time, a wider cultural shift had taken place, both outside of and within the Cherokee Nation. In recent years, many Native people are returning to their Two-Spirit traditions as a way to heal from the injustices the American colonial project has visited upon their ancestors and traditions. In 2011, the first known U.S. Two-Spirit powwow was organized by the Bay Area American Indian Two-Spirits. Since then, powwows honoring Two-Spirits have been held in Montana and Kansas. And in March of 2017, the largest powwow in the U.S., the Gathering of Nations, honored Two-Spirit people during its grand entry. Two-Spirit identity is resilient and precious. It has survived centuries of colonial violence and prejudice. These sacred ways of knowing live on amongst Native youth seeking to know more about themselves, elders who have kept the traditions alive in spite of the odds, and anyone in between. It should go without saying, but Two-Spirit is not a poetic way for non-Native LGBTQ people to express themselves. We're looking at you, Jason Mraz. It is, however, a sacred tradition among the first peoples of this land we call Turtle Island that all of its inhabitants should know about and respect.
All right, so hopefully that was informative and also provides some insight as to how other cultures throughout time have looked at gender in different ways. And for so much of how we have been socialized in our time and preceding our time, since, America's formation and before that, gender roles have played a very strong and significant part of that culture and has mostly existed within the binary structures that we're talking about today. So to dive into, and I shouldn't have stopped sharing my screen because I want to also share a little bit more of a highlight on how we might think about and look at gender with this great graphic, the gender unicorn. And again, I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. And if folks have questions about this later, please make that a point of our discussion today. But gender is something that is extremely expansive, and in the way that myself and many others look at gender identity is can be fluid and it can exist in multiple states. So when we're looking at gender identity, that's how one identifies with their gender, whether that challenges the gender that they were assigned at birth or not. There are many different kind of ways that gender can be represented, or how I can feel personally about how I identify my gender, which is different than my gender expression, which is how I choose to present my gender to the world. And that can be feminine, it can be masculine, it can be other ways of manifesting my gender identity in the way that I express. I could be a non-binary person that presents more masculine and could often be perceived as male. That doesn't make me any less non-binary. It simply is the way that I choose to express my gender versus how I identify with my gender. Sex, we addressed a little bit earlier. And then because of how the social narrative of gender and sexual orientation have been convoluted and kind of bunched together, which I'm going to talk about through some of my own personal story. There are also different ways or means of attraction, of physically and emotionally attracted to women, men, other genders. So this could, depending on how you identify, your gender spectrum might look something like this, which is obviously much more unique and unique and on this spectrum of identity, as opposed to kind of this like light switch of man, woman, and what that means in the context of like this like how we exist in the world today. So I wanted to just highlight that. Again, I can send that to folks, but I think it's a great kind of way to start looking at gender in a way that does challenge and break the binary constructs in which many of us have been socialized to believe are just right or just simply exist in that state. So Now that we've highlighted some of the ways that we can think about gender, I'd like to share a little bit about my own personal story and my journey to better understanding myself. And within that, identify and discuss some of the traumas that are experienced by folks. And again, I don't want to make I want to underscore that I do not speak for everyone who has gone on various journeys of identifying themselves across the gender spectrum. So some of my own story, I grew up very conservative Baptist. From a young age, I showed an interest in more feminine gender presentation, from wanting that pink boa at the fair to playing Princess Jasmine during make-believe, but that was very much discouraged in my family dynamic in church spaces. I grew up in predominantly what I call a church basement school, which was a small private school that was kindergarten to 12th grade. We had about 56 students across the entire school. I was one of 3 kids in my grades. They actually clustered us into groups of 10. So we had 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade as or 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th as 2 classes, so that there were enough students for the teacher. And I talk about that specifically because we had a dress code, which is obviously differentiated by gender, boy and girl, and the non-conformity was strongly discouraged. Had to wear slacks and a shirt and a tie through, your full school days, even in 90-degree summers. No shorts were allowed. But that really started to set this precedent for how I was socialized into my own gender, as well as what was right and what was wrong. And kids, I don't have to tell anyone on this call, but are extremely intelligent and very perceptive. And being told things that are right and things that are wrong do not have to be so explicitly, this is right, this is wrong. If you erase something from the dialogue completely, you just grow up believing that it's wrong or just doesn't exist. And so that's as I started to come into my own understanding of my placement in the world. There were questions surrounding why wasn't some of the things that I was feeling being talked about or discussed in my school environment, in my church environment, etc. So I started lobbying to get into public school since I was in the 5th grade, I think, which because I never really felt totally in my element within the school environment that I was in. I was successful in the 7th grade, which was just in time to start at a new school in a 5-town district for year 1 of junior high school. And at this point in my life, shocking to many folks who I know now currently, but I was extremely shy at school. I was very quiet. And my newfound ability to choose my own clothes to wear to school, at school, very much contrasted with the fact that I had never had that option before. And some of my sheltered upbringing, my whole style was from Boy Meets World. If folks are familiar with the show, I was that is the look that I need to go for. And I'll also underscore in that the importance of representation in media, and we'll talk about visibility and representation as I kind of go through this talk a little bit more. But to never see folks that really challenged or lived outside of some of the expected gender roles in media and film and representation is also something that is severely harmful to young queer folks growing into themselves because of how little we might see ourselves represented. There's an incredible documentary called Disclosure about trans representation in media on Netflix. If folks haven't seen it, it's one that I encourage folks to watch. It's really powerful, and it talks about the challenges of poor representation of trans folks in media, and also the importance that representation was there for others to see themselves in some way in media. But that has a whole other subtext of conversation that I could go down that I will hold unless folks want to kind of address some of those things when we open up to kind of our dialogue after my talk. But so seventh grade, one day I was late to school and I had to sit in front of the chorus class, which totally mortified me because usually I would sit in the back where I wasn't heard. At the end of the class, the teacher asked me to stay and because she wanted to talk with me, and I was like, oh shit, I'm getting in trouble. I was late, but she was like, oh, you have a good voice. You should join show choir. And for folks who are not familiar, just think the TV show Glee. That was most of my junior high and high school experience, which actually was in no overly dramatic sense of me saying this, was a life-saving thing for me when I was in my high school years. So as I got more into music and being comfortable with myself, whatever that means, as like a tween, as you're navigating all the hormones and the changes and everything that you're experiencing, I got labeled the gay kid. And I was labeled the gay kid literally before I knew really what that term meant. We were very successfully sheltered as children, and obviously, like looking back at some of my own experience and the traumas that manifested through like feeling so othered and different within like growing up in a mostly unsupportive environment, I recognize that some of like my recollection and recall to those times were often survival responses. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit as well. But so I was kind of labeled something before I even really knew what that meant. And so I kind of knew the concept of what it meant to be gay, but it was never really discussed. So when I started having a crush on the boy in the 8th grade, I was all sorts of screwed up, inherently knowing that it was wrong because I hadn't seen any boys with other boys like that. I hadn't seen that really in TV or what I was allowed to watch at home. Anytime same-sex attraction or relationship came up at church, it was under the definition of sodomy. So like you got so many mixed, not really no mixed messages. You're feeling like mixed feelings internally, but there's very bold and present statements of like, this is wrong, something's wrong with you. And all of those feelings, I navigated alone for a long time. And so fast forward to my freshman year, I was thrown out of the closet, both at home and at school, which led to multiple years of navigating the challenging waters of an unsupportive home environment because how God felt about my gayness and the horrors of just being a teenager in high school. But I was an early 2000s high schooler, so there was a decent contingent of mostly girls who thought it was really cool to have a GBF or a gay best friend. And now I'm not saying that I didn't have any authentic relationships in high school with people that valued me for me, but there were plenty of those, Josh, you're like my gay best friend, so let's go shopping, instances from girls whose birthday parties I wasn't even invited to. So there becomes now this commoditization of one's identity, as I was also really trying to figure out who and what I was and how I identified. And it wasn't until much later in my life that I realized that my queerness was defined by the comfort level of those around me and those who seemed to accept me for me under a label I wasn't totally comfortable with, but was branded with so heavily, I couldn't remove it if I tried. And much of it I didn't want to. There were things that I was like, oh yeah, this does start to make sense. Like there was truth in my gayness. And for a long time, I thought that that was the missing piece of my puzzle about the things that I was navigating. Like this started to make more sense. And in all of this, I want to take a moment to mention the role of shame, which is a very, very present feeling and something that is, I think, often weaponized in our society, especially when trying to make folks identify and conform with the dominant culture within a group. So I'm sure we can all recall a time in the past, and most likely the present as well, where we felt shame. And some shame can be a motivator to do things that we shouldn't do, like steal, for example. But the shame I'm talking about is more like socially pervasive and often unacknowledged feeling. And so the Oxford Dictionary defines shame as a painful feeling of humiliation or distress caused by the consciousness of wrong or foolish behavior. But as a queer kid, trying to navigate the complexity of my identity without even having the words to articulate to myself what I was going through, I would adapt that definition to be more honest to how I've experienced shame, which is a painful feeling of humiliation or distress caused by a divergence from popular social norms as accepted by a dominant group or culture. And that is something that I want to underscore in all of this as well, is as we talk about the traumas associated with the gender binary and feelings of otherness, I want to like really put an asterisk, bold, and underline the role that shame plays and how many of us can be complicit in making folks feel shame, whether intentional or not. So I want to just kind of underscore and highlight that for consideration as we move through this talk. So when I was in my early teens, I was under a constant feeling of humiliation, distress, or fear because of who I was becoming and how much that diverged with everything that I was taught to believe as a young person. I was a different person at school than I was at home, than I was at church, and I had to juggle all of those identities, different stories, different relationships. And it was a toxic stress that now, after many therapy sessions as an adult, I've realized impacted my ability to authentically show up for myself and others during that time. And it also clouded many of my memories from childhood because I was in this constant state of survival mode for me. And I often looked at and saw the challenges of others in the world and dismissed my own because I was taught to believe that I was fortunate, that I had it great compared to a lot of other kids, that I was loved, I had a roof over my head, that I was fed, which was true. I grew up with a lot of privilege, which I acknowledge. And I also wouldn't be doing a service to young queer kids growing up in a diversity of home environments and economic positions if I also didn't address the trauma of growing up queer in an unsupportive environment. And that's when Amy and I were talking kind of at the beginning of this, we talk about the intersections of social justice work and the things that we're involved with. And one of the things that often comes up is a tool of the oppressor is putting folks who are oppressed and marginalized against each other by saying, oh, my oppression is worse than your oppression. So let's have these in-fight battles as opposed to addressing the actual oppressor the harms that are being caused by us, by society more largely. And so I think it's really important to look at how the role of trauma of folks who are in oppressed and marginalized groups and recognize where that comes from. And that could be a larger conversation about, the toxic patriarchy and power constructs that are inequitably distributed. And I'm happy to nerd out about that towards the end if folks want to, follow that pathway. But I want to really talk and hone in on the importance of this, what at the time for me, and again, only speaking for myself personally, but it was this silent trauma that I was experiencing that I didn't acknowledge it as trauma at that point, because I also didn't have the tools to talk about what trauma was and how that manifested and the impact that it would have on my life and my ability to kind of push forward. And when I share my story now, some folks are like, wow, you were really resilient, like you really made it through. And I want to talk about and caution folks on how we talk about resilience as this thing that should be so like a badge of honor. And it's something that should absolutely be respected. But when we see folks who have experienced harms and had to be resilient in order to survive, I would rather be talking about how do we create situations in which those harms are never caused to begin with, so we don't have to have young people being resilient and making it against all odds to survive. Growing up in a conservative faith community that never really discussed what I was feeling and never opened doorways for me to feel safe asking questions led to me being shut off almost entirely from what I thought to be my support network growing up as a young person. So navigating relationships and heartbreak as a young teen that I couldn't take to my parents because they were relationships that wouldn't be supported, led to some serious sadness that I masked in smiles and busyness. I went in and out of unaddressed depression that led to multiple plans for how to end my life over the course of my high school years, simply for trying to understand and better navigate who I was becoming, and why it was wrong, which is the hardest thing. You're like, I'm having these feelings towards people of like love and like appreciation, and I feel better about myself when I'm in environments where I feel accepted. So what is so wrong about this? But what's so wrong about me? And I didn't have a clear place to go for support. There was a pair of teachers in my high school that was a lesbian couple, but mostly known by rumor only. There was a GSA that I feared getting involved with because I also was combating this, like, oh, I don't want to be seen as othered in that way, like the small group was. And I was still a high school kid trying to fit in, as I was trying to fight for my gayness to be accepted, right? But just my gayness. It was like, oh, there's parts about me that are like cool, but like I understand why we other others, right? It's this whole like social dialogue of like, oh, I'm gay, but I'm not that gay. So like I'm acceptable, right? And so that's where I talk about how my queerness was really constructed by the comfort level of those around me. And I never really got into being able to explore the authentic self that I am much more now representative of. And so you might be asking, like, why are they talking about their sexuality and not their gender identity? That's not part of the presentation. And you'd be right, but also wrong, because of how society has really built this narrative that tie the two very closely together. And through all that time, and I still felt like something was missing, I moved through years after high school to different colleges and jobs. I lived in multiple states, and then I ended up in Worcester. And I had graduated from WPI after being immersed in my major and in music. I had started my first nonprofit, Action Worcester, while running my consulting business. And I had started getting a bit more involved in the LGBTQ plus community. I also want to note that busyness is an extremely powerful way to ignore things in one's life that you don't want to address. And I was a master at being very, very busy. And again, one of those things that I reflect back as I navigated my own experience of surviving through high school was, if I was great at everything, the bad part of me that was unaccepted by folks in my family and like my church environment wouldn't be that bad. I would always be doing something that drew the attention away from that thing. But that thing was always this motivator of like, I have to be better than just being a human that is worthy and deserving of love and acceptance. I have to prove that I'm valid. I have to prove that I have worth. And this is something I know a lot of queer folks face, and a lot of folks who are, living in environments that challenge or are unaccepting of who they are. And so I met and developed a relationship with a close friend of mine who I'm still very good friends with, who is the first person I allowed myself to kind of take the blinders off. Some people are like, Josh, how are you, 25, 26 years old and never really thought about like gender identity in this way? And I had so successfully buried any feelings or associations to my identity that was not fully constructed in what I just wanted the world to see, that I had almost totally like erased some of the existence of other beings in the world that I've so resonated with. And so this person, their gender expression was queer as hell. They said whatever was on their mind. And it seemed like the concept of shame and like societal expectation had like never crossed their path. This is obviously untrue, but because as we got deeper into conversation, we found some similar experiences in our story and things that were also very different. And we allowed ourselves to move past what we saw to more authentically connect to who we were as people. And that's another thing that I think is so important in this. And we're talking about gender expression and what people wear and how they show up in the world. That in and of itself can be such a powerful motivator for some and agitator for others. Like the amount of anger that I have faced having a beard and wearing makeup and a dress is unfathomable to me. But I do understand where it comes from, because I was socialized in very similar ways to be very much against that, just that sight. It's like I'm a computer program that's like having like a malfunction, right? It's like, why am I seeing this? Like beards aren't supposed to be matched with made up eyes, and the dress and like the hairy legs, like what's happening, right? Because of how we've been socialized to think about this. So simply being visible in a way that is different is something that is in and of itself something that one has to achieve. The ability of either not caring or feeling confident and courageous enough to show up in the world in that way. And, it was through these conversations with this friend that I started having realizations of what I was still very much concealing from myself. And, those buried memories from my past where the femininity I expressed was extinguished. And I was being introduced to concepts that were not new, centuries old, as a matter of fact, but very new to me about gender identity and expression. And I allowed myself to begin exploring that. And the reason I'm sharing so much of kind of my backstory and my journey here is because we're just now in my late 20s getting to a place where I allowed myself to start exploring more authentically who I was and starting to shed the barriers that society had placed in my way from getting there. So within this, and when I talk about the impact that being an affirming and accepting and loving voice in the life of a young person can do, imagine the power of me being a young person who didn't have these social hurdles and barriers to exploring and understanding who I was. And because I'm sitting here in front of you, all having the ability to have this conversation is a testament to simply the fact that I survived, and a lot of young people have not. And that isn't something to be celebrated. I think that's something to be really reflective of and think about our own personal roles in the lives of young people. And this is where, I always encourage folks at the top of these calls is to lean into discomfort, because standing up for someone who is in an environment where it's much easier to be quiet is very uncomfortable. But it is something that's so critically important in telling folks that they matter, that they are valid, that they're deserving, that they're worthy, and that could literally save somebody's life. And so most people, as I'm walking through the world, notice all the makeup and the beard and the heels. The beard's usually involved in some way, but that's only like one layer of my identity, right? It's a manifestation of how I've come to better know myself. And conversations that I have with folks that stop at the surface level indicate how much work still needs to be done in our society. And so I'm not a religious person anymore, but I am very spiritual and a big believer in energy. And I think a lot of people close themselves off to the power of individuality because society has created this narrative that conformity is comfort. It leads to success, of feeling included. But I imagine every one of us has felt the weight of having to conform in some way. The desire to explore something. Maybe it's a new hobby that you feel your friends would make fun of you for, a new hairstyle or color, or I don't know, you see this badass jacket that you love, but then realize it's in the women's section. Allowing myself to open up to both masculine, feminine, and gender transcendent energies has really deepened my connection to myself it's amplified empathy for others, and it's helped me see so much more clearly about how I show up in the world and the things that truly matter and the things that are deserving of my time and energy. In my work with my company, Action by Design, I help organizations address social challenges through equity-centered design and facilitation. And in that work, equity, diversity, and inclusion play a central role in how I help organizations pursue new initiative ideas and build inclusive innovation ecosystems. And so I've talked about some of the personal level and also blowing that out to the organizational and kind of cultural level. Research shows that the more authentically someone is able to show up at work, the more innovative that organizational climate is. And, again, taking it back to the personal, we know that just one affirming adult in the life of an LGBTQ plus young person reduces their likelihood of attempting suicide by 40%. There is a clear indication that tapping into our authentic individual selves has a net positive impact on the individual and the groups they participate in. And so I encourage folks to look around you. The world is such a powerfully beautiful place because of diversity. Imagine a garden you walk through with just 2 types of flowers instead of a walk through the botanical gardens with hundreds of different types of plants of various shapes, sizes, colors, etc. The nature of binary systems eliminates an infinite spectrum of possibilities in between. And so there have been a lot of strides in challenging social constructs around gender, with movements to support and encourage more girls to pursue STEM careers, for example. But there's also so much more work to be done to call out and change harmful systems that continue to oppress marginalized genders. And a lot of that work begins in shifting our perspective of how we talk about gender and how we approach the discussion of gender and gender concepts and how those are presented to our youth, as well as individuals like myself who feel that I've only really been getting a proper education on gender and sexuality in my late 20s. So here's some data as well. And again, I am very passionately connected to supporting LGBTQ plus young people. 40% of LGBTQ young people seriously considered attempting suicide in the past 12 months, with more than half of transgender and non-binary youth having seriously considered. 68% of queer and trans youth reported symptoms of generalized anxiety disorder in the past 2 weeks, including more than 3 in 4 trans and non-binary youth. 6 out of 10 queer and trans youth said that someone attempted to convince them to change their sexual orientation or gender identity. 98% of queer and trans students report hearing homophobic slurs at school. 68% of those hearing homophobic or transphobic statements from teachers and staff. And unfortunately, I could continue citing stats like this for a long time, including how trans folks are more likely to be unemployed due to workplace discrimination than cis coworkers, and how trans folks are disproportionately represented in unhoused populations. We need to address the trauma of the gender binary and create systems of unconditional support in our communities. And when I say we need to address the trauma of the gender binary, I'm not trying to erase the identity of anybody. And this is something that often comes up in diversity, equity, and inclusion work, primarily with cis white men saying that they feel that they're being erased from the social dialogue, which is not the intention or the reason that we are involved in this work. It is to allow the true diversity of everyone's authentic selves to come to the forefront and be celebrated, welcomed, and accepted. And we know that by having 2 options and then creating an infinite amount of options, we're simply just going to see more authentically diverse folks represented. So what might a future beyond the binary look like? And I mentioned earlier that I'm president and co-founder of an organization called Love Your Labels. Our mission is to work with, celebrate, and explore identity with LGBTQ plus youth through art, fashion, and design. Our vision is a world without bias, stigma, and shame. And by addressing the impacts and harms of bias, stigma, and shame in the world, we believe that we can create spaces that allow for the authentic exploration of self, which I think is one of the things that we strip away from our young people way too early. We direct young boys to, instead of, wanting to pursue dance, to play football. And I'm making generalizations again, and I'm not saying boys shouldn't be playing football. I don't want that to be misrepresented, but I'm saying that because of multiple layers of social constructs around gender, we are harming and limiting our young people who grow into all of us adults from being happy, fulfilled, and finding joy connected to things that motivate them the most. And that not only has a net positive impact on, again, the young person themselves growing up and finding that fulfillment and finding that support, but it also impacts our communities, our society more broadly, because of how people have to navigate and fight against these systems simply to be included. I have still some challenging conversations with folks in my immediate family around why I do, this work, or, why I'm involved in supporting LGBTQ rights and access, and, being involved in social justice work. And I have started really posing the question back to them, like, what do you think I could be doing if we were simply accepted? So many people have to do this work because it's what is required in order for us to realize a world better than what we grew up in. And I know, speaking for myself, there are so many things that I would be doing if I didn't have to advocate for this. And so one of the things that, I would call for everyone who's interested in being involved in this work and reducing the traumas that young people, young queer and trans folks have as they grow up and navigate their identity, is to be present, to show up and take some level of an active role in advocacy work that really centers equity, looking toward a vision of equality. So I mentioned what might, a future beyond the binary look like, the work of Love Your Labels. I also mentioned that, a world beyond the binary simply uplifts people, tells them that they matter and that they're loved. And that is an extremely powerful tool. And again, resilience not being seen as this badge of honor because we survived something. Instead, if we see someone having to be resilient in the face of adversity, we target that adversity and identify ways to eliminate it from society. So just some takeaways, and then I would love to open it up to questions. Visibility and representation matter. If you work with youth, you work with queer youth, whether you know it or not. It's important to center the lived experience of queer and trans folks in curriculum and conversation. 2, language matters. I didn't have the vocabulary to articulate how I was feeling until my late 20s surrounding gender identity. And yes, this can still happen in 2021. You never know if you're the first person or only person to affirm a young person's experience, or simply give them the tools to help them on their path of discovery. So we need to provide more resources for young people to explore who they are. And part of that, and this is an immediate action, is advocating for LGBTQ plus competent sexual health curriculum for kindergarten to 12th grade. I will always plug that. We had it recently passed and approved for the 3 R's curriculum in the Worcester Public Schools. And now it's our responsibility as folks in the community to make sure that that is implemented in a way that is appropriate and actually connecting young people to the resources that they need to support their growth and development. I'm going to say language matters again. You be on the lookout for homophobic, transphobic, and otherwise bigoted language from youth and adults in all settings. And once you start tuning into that, you'll be shocked at how frequently things that might seem innocuous to things that are more like, wow, I can't believe someone just said that, exist in our day-to-day, in our day-to-day. Things like "that's so gay" used as an insult, which is still something that is present in society, is rooted in misogyny and the patriarchy. And again, happy to explore that. But the degradation of effeminate men is absolutely 100% linked to misogyny and anti-femininity. And that's something that we need to address in our communities. For those who work with young people or have any conversations with anyone about their futures, encourage passion over gender roles. It shouldn't matter who wants to play soccer or dance ballet or build tree forts or study science. We need to create nurturing, supportive spaces for youth to pursue what they are passionate about. And part of that is by challenging and breaking the gender binary. Then the last two things that I think are so critically important are love is more impactful as an action than a feeling. I've too often been told, we didn't want this for you because of how hard it would be because of society, or we love you no matter what. But I'm like, if that's the response, help me change society as my response, right? Love is an action. It's how you show up for people. It's not how you feel about somebody, because that we can't do a lot with feelings. It's very intangible. I'd much rather have tangible examples of how I am loved than the intangible. And to ally is an action. Commit to that constant pursuit of learning, be open to new ideas, be an active listener, and be involved in the work that needs to be done to realize these spaces where young people can thrive no matter who they are. Thank you. And I'll open for questions.
Josh, that was so amazing. There, like you said so many things that I was like, oh my God, that's so well put. I'm hoping lots of people here have the same, kind of, even in the chat, people, I saw you got an interview request as you're talking.
Yes, thank you, Maria.
I think the first thing you said that really shook me a little bit was how much other people's comfort level about who you are was dictating how you show up. Like that rung so true. First off, and then is also so harmful. And you did an amazing job, as I expected, of really highlighting that the harm is not about the person's identity. The harm is about society's response to that and what that means. And just what you just said about the curriculum made me think a little bit bigger, like that times when people are suppressing information, the motive is almost always to harm people, right? Like whenever you don't want people to have information, like, why is that, right? And so much about that is people's comfort level and willingness to harm young people. It's a really complex topic. And I love that you really brought it to actions we can take. And if you, I don't know, if anybody has a question, feel free to jump right in. If nothing comes right away, Josh, could you talk a little bit about the sort of move towards pronouns? I know that's a place where I have heard people say, like, don't make me do the pronouns, like, and not really recognize the importance, the value, like what that's about. And I've certainly been guilty of it myself, not being as attentive and deliberate about my pronoun choices. So if you wouldn't mind saying anything about that.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. And thanks for bringing that up. It's something that I know a lot of organizations have been having conversations around. And I think some are being much more successful than that in others. And doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work myself, I have literally sat in a boardroom of executives and the CEO of the company introduced me and said, "This is Josh. I don't believe in they, them pronouns, but they're going to be this person's going to be doing DEI trainings with us." And so there is such a profound disconnect between why of pronouns, and again, this kind of articulates the piece of like what I'm wearing is the very top layer of the conversation, right? Putting pronouns in email signatures or having conversations around really kind of retraining some of how we address folks based on how they identify, it does take learning, and it takes that commitment to learning. As someone using they, them pronouns, I will still screw up people's pronouns from time to time. And that's something that's okay. You know, I'm used to that. I give a lot of grace to people with my own pronouns, because of that recognition of like, it does take a committed effort to do that. But what is the most harmful, I think, is when people simply say like, well, that doesn't matter, or it's stupid, or I think it's grammatically incorrect. And then I say to someone, oh, I love the art on the wall. I wonder like who that artist is. Like, I love their work. And, you know, instantly people are like, oh yeah, that's just regular conversation about a singular person. And it's a gender we don't know, and it's, you know, a piece of art. Or, excuse me, someone left their wallet on the table at this diner that I'm sitting in, and I don't know because they left, right? So the grammatically incorrect argument is an ignorant argument. But what is more important for people to recognize is that by saying that pronouns are stupid, or ignore, or not being willing to even try to learn them, it means that you are comfortable erasing an identity of people who might be very closely held relationships in your life, but simply because retraining your mind to reframe sentences is too hard, that is a really challenging argument for me to face, because it's saying that you don't value my existence enough to respect that effort, right? We make efforts all the time to learn and do things in different ways, because of people in our lives, or, you know, what have you. And so by really just saying like, I think it's stupid, some people are genuinely just making that statement without thinking about all the layers to that. And I hope people recognize that there are many layers to that. There are many layers to that. And, you know, I had a conversation with a friend of mine the other day, and she was like, my mom called me and she was like, I don't understand. She was like, I get the pronouns thing. I support it totally, but I'm a cis woman. And like, I don't get why it's important for me to have I didn't get why it's important for me to have my pronouns and my signatures. And then I was like, solidarity. Oh, right. Because oftentimes I, as the only non-binary person in a room, have to be like, hi, I'm Josh, they, them pronouns. And everyone kind of gives you a look. And I can't tell you how amazing it is sometimes when a cis woman sitting next to me is like, hi, I'm Tina, she, her pronouns. And I'm like, great, we got the pronouns kicked off. I don't have to be yet again, like the already person who's like standing out, looking like wearing whatever and being like, hi, they, them pronouns. Like, let's start that conversation. So like that connection and like solidarity is like really, really powerful.
Yeah, agree. Another thing that just kind of blew my mind towards the end, you talked about, you know, if we did away with the binary, imagine all the possibilities that exist there, which was thrilling and exciting and an amazing thing to think. Goes along well with your thought about like, if I did not have to contend with this, how much further along would I be, you know, in sharing my gifts, in bringing to the table what my authentic self. And then another thing that struck me was,
and in that, sorry to interrupt there.
No.
In that, I also want to name and acknowledge that is an aspirational hope, and that within the context of our time, it is really important to address harms that have specifically been targeted on marginalized genders, right? Like, because of how society has harmed women and trans folks and folks within marginalized genders, there is a need to respond to those needs in a very intentional and specific way, because of how gender has played a role in the construction of our systems. we know that women are more likely to experience systems of prostitution and exploitation because they are women and they are targeted because of that reason. Disproportionately trans and LGBTQ folks are included in that. And we need services and organizations that are specifically working within the understanding that because people identify as women or other marginalized genders, that they need specific supports that society has not been providing. So I just want to, that's another thing that I think is really critical to address, is like we have the aspirational vision of a world beyond the binary and recognize that in our current social state, we need to address things based on how society has been built and constructed, similar to race, right? There's a similar conversation that I've had discussions around relative to racial equity. I was sitting with a team of scientists and like, shouldn't we be post-racial? Race is a social construct as well. We should just like treat everybody the same and like ignore race. And it's the whole like colorblind or I don't see color thing. But we recognize that because of systemic and historic harms that continue to be perpetuated in our society and violence that occurs to folks because of their race, we need to address that in order to move to an aspirational view of a world devoid of race and gender, et cetera.
And I love that that's where you went, because that was my next thought as well. When you said about how much hate you've received because of the surface level, that like is so hard to hear, right? And I know I kind of started off thinking like, wow, we've come a long way. And, how offensive is that in the wake of hearing that in your lived experience, we maybe, but you're getting hatred and like, and that is just shows that we really do have so much work to do. And whenever I hear that, like one of the things that I often say, when you're in an uncomfortable conversation, like paying attention to what really triggers you, because that's your stuff, right? And so I recognize that, yes, people are putting you as the bullseye, but it's their issues. Like it's their own discomfort with themselves, their discomfort with the rules, the discomfort with whatever it is that makes you offensive to them. It is about them. And the fact that this is still happening so much shows me we all have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I had a conversation recently with a father who is very involved in his church community and had actually reached out to grab coffee with me just because he had seen some of my work and knew a little bit about my story and my upbringing with the church. And, we sat down and he had a child who was navigating their own gender identity and expression and really trying to grapple with that and his faith and what they had preached historically. And he used the example of an upcoming wedding that they were going to be attending where his child wanted to assign male at birth, wanted to come and present an address and made it about, we had the conversation around, well, I'm just hoping that my child doesn't do that because of what it will, what impact that will have and like what we will say and blah, blah, blah. And, in that, I wanted to really highlight the fact that what your child wears to the wedding has no bearing on anything other than people's own levels of like uncomfortability around that, right? It's more of a reflection on them than it is that your child, and you're putting the onus of an entire wedding and you're making it the responsibility of your child simply because they want to wear what they want to wear. And, that was actually a really productive conversation. And he later sent me photos of the wedding and they were looking fierce in their dress and they looked like happy family. But, there are also scenarios in which and this is one of the reasons I'm extremely passionate and connected to this work, is because I have in my own life been told that the level of uncomfortability that people have with how I dress is reason enough to not want me to be around young people in my life, children. And like that is again like the much more potent narrative is like, it's not that you want me to not wear a dress around, you know, a 5 or 6 year old. It's that you disagree with my life so strongly that you're fearful of my identity being around a young child. So you're saying that my identity can negatively impact the development of a young person, where my whole life is built around affirming, loving, and supportive like environment building. Right. And so that is something that's really hard for me to navigate. So it's like, do I not show up in the life of these young people because it compromises part of who I am? Or do I compromise part of that person in order to show up in that person's life and try and set example as much as I can in the ways that I can? And that's really, really challenging because I'm being asked to compromise something that I had to fight and survive to become, and it's being asked to like be retracted again, right? And so that is like, there's continued harm and continued trauma that happens, and it's a really difficult thing to navigate.
Yeah, it's blown my mind, all of the layers and the importance of showing up for young people. You've highlighted that a couple times, and that 40% stat is huge. And I imagine that for each person that affirms you and loves you and right there for you, the risk goes down. That's trauma in general, right? The antidote is connection and relationship, and having people that care about you unconditionally is really the only thing that undoes any trauma, the harm from trauma. So stressing that and putting that right out front, I think, is so important. What other people, I saw somebody had a comment in the chat that I didn't completely understand, and I was hoping that maybe, all right, Vered Brandman, I hope I said your name.
Vered, yeah.
Can you say more about that? I didn't quite understand what you meant in that.
So the status as a person whose identity is prioritized primes us to, quote, not see bigotry, which upholds bigotry and upholds our relative privileges. So, for example, I am bi, I'm also white, I'm also cis. As a cis person, I am trained to not see bigotry against trans and non-binary and gender diverse people, because not seeing it upholds the system that we have, but also my relative privilege in particular. And so it is my job to be mindful of that and remember that and keep an eye out. And it is not really anybody else's job to educate me. It is not really anybody else's job to, like, if somebody feels that I have done wrong and feel strongly enough to tell me about it, that means that they think that I don't want to do harm. They believe that I don't intend harm, and then I would want to change if it means not doing harm. And I think that's I mean, it's sad that I, made a mistake, but I think it's great that they think that I have potential. So
yeah, that's an incredible point. And in a lot of these spaces, I talk about the intention versus impact, and how the things that we might intend in a comment or something that we say might not intend to cause harm, but the impact that it has is very much causing harm. And that there needs to be relationships in one's life where folks are comfortable, calling people in or calling them out when necessary, because of exactly what you're stating, because they're recognizing and acknowledging that you might not be intending to cause harm. And part of that is trust. And a lot of the community building and coalition building work that I do uses an equity-centered design framework that starts with addressing harm and healing, navigating and building trust, and then beginning the work of identifying challenges, creating solutions, and building from there. But so much of the need in our communities is for people to have folks in their lives who will call them out or call them in when those opportunities present themselves. So I think that's hugely important.
Yeah, beautiful. Took me a minute to understand it, but now that I do, yes, thank you. That's really helpful. Other people, thoughts, comments, questions, pieces that really resonated or helped you better understand this experience for people?
I had a question.
Put your phone
Hi,
in.
my name is Jessica. I heard you say that you had, some positive experiences with therapy. But as a therapist, I was just wondering, I know you can't speak for everyone, of course, but, are therapy spaces, spaces that are ready and welcoming, or how can we do better as therapists? I feel like I've worked in a lot of environments where it's not that much different than the rest of society, and we can be very unprepared.
Yes, and thank you.
Thank you.
That's a fantastic question. It actually took me multiple therapist tries to find one that I ended up resonating with. And some were just not a great fit, and some were like very much, I felt, using me as an opportunity for learning, as opposed to really being like, I want to show up to therapy and not be a teacher for a minute, like I want to be able to talk about my queerness and my non-binary identity, and it be like, yep, that's part of like who you are. Let's explore that. Like, how is that, impacted you? And so I think literacy around LGBTQ plus identity is hugely important in this. And also, asking very thoughtful questions about about where people want to start really as well, and what they want to explore. Because I feel like, and in many instances, our queer and trans identity is going to play a significant role in what we want to talk about in therapy, but it sometimes is like the assumed, like, let's talk about your gayness. Like, why is that the reason that you are the way you are, right? And so I think there's literacy and competency that's so crucial and important, and also making it easier for folks like me to find therapists who are even just being thoughtful to that and showing up in spaces like this. Like, I can't say enough how much I wish that there was like a registry that I could go on to and say like LGBT identifying and or competent therapists in my area. And like, that's extremely difficult to find. And then we get into the whole inequitable healthcare conversation around like what's covered and what's not under certain plans. And, it can really re-traumatize folks who are like, I finally found this space to talk, and then being met with some things that really challenge like yourself, like I'm as a queer, non-binary, polyamorous, non-monogamous person, it's extremely difficult to find therapy that is like resonates with my belief structures, my identity, my experiences. So thank you for raising that question. I wish I had a better answer of like, go to this resource, but it's still something that I think is so much of a need in the space.
Very appreciated when people want to do a good job too. I love that. I'm grateful. Joanna, did you want to?
Hi, Amy. Yes, I did. And Joshua, I as an aunt of a gay young man and one of my nibblings who is exploring transitioning and gender identity, I really thank you for sharing your story today. I'm a nurse, and one of the things that you just said about wishing that there was a registry or a way to focus people towards providers who are helpful and understanding in that. I want that too, from a medical perspective. And Amy is aware, as we're on Facebook together, that I am a gynecological cancer survivor, and September is Gynecological Cancer Awareness Month. And I have been racking my brain trying to find resources to put out there that were not gender specific in nature, to remind folks who are non-binary and who are on the transgender spectrum, or, you know, I might be using wrong terminology and I apologize, but to remind folks that just because your outward appearance is not the same as organs you were born with, I want you to remember to please you know, get the appropriate health care. And that might mean, just like you said, with a therapist, that you might reach out and not have success the first few times connecting with somebody. Please don't stop, whether it's therapy, whether it's your physical health, whatever it is, you know, continue to explore and get the right treatment that you need.
Absolutely. And one of the models that I'll point to that does a really great job with trans inclusive healthcare is out in Boston is Fenway Health.
Yeah.
So yeah, Fenway is an incredible example of queer and trans inclusive priority in healthcare. And one of the initiatives that I'm helping to run here in Worcester is a newly found queer coalition of Greater Worcester. And some of our work is going in the coming months is specifically going to be prioritizing healthcare equity and creating more pipelines to resources for folks. There is, and I am blanking on her name, and I feel terrible about that, but there's a doctor who at the Edward M. Kennedy Health Center that is building out and expanding their trans inclusive services, both from hormone therapy to also just general primary care. So there are some, yes, Anna McMahon, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, and so that is a great resource to go for some of those kind of health inclusive language guides and things like that.
Thank you.
That was a great thing to raise as well. I know that healthcare is a place where oppression shows up in so many ways on so many levels, and this is yet one more way that people that are oppressed have those experiences in healthcare settings even. Josh, you talked about sort of the call to action and how to get involved. And if people feel like, wow, now that I'm realizing what this is about, how can I be a better ally? How can I advocate? Interpersonally, I think people get that. But do you have any other thoughts or suggestions about ways people can be more supportive and inclusive?
Yeah, I'm sure. So I will obviously plug Love Your Labels. We always look for folks to get involved. We do events like Drag Queen Storytime, where really that's a space for learning and just like love and supportive space for diverse families to come and engage in some reading for the kids, but also just having and being aware that there's an intentional space being set for queer and trans kids and queer and trans families is a great way for folks to kind of get involved. The other thing that I would point to is the Pride Worcester organizations. There are a lot of different organizations that have various focuses of their work, which can be visited at prideworcester.org. And these are also the organizations that currently represent the Queer Coalition of Greater Worcester. There are organizations like 508 Pride, which is doing more community advocacy and action work. There is AIDS Project Worcester, which provides free STI testing and a lot of community-based services for the LGBTQ plus community. The LGBT Asylum Task Force, one of the things that our community needs is money. There's absolutely opportunities for giving. The LGBT Asylum Task Force helps asylum seekers from other countries fleeing persecution because of their LGBT identity seek asylum here in the US, and they house them and provide them stipends and help them with legal fees here in the community. So we have a really powerful and strong community of folks doing this work, but they also need support in time, money, connections, resources. takes a village is an understatement for this stuff. But I also some great GLSEN, GLSEN, and the Trevor Project have a lot of great resources that have everything from language to use that's more inclusive to stats on information about young LGBTQ plus people. And so those are some great like knowledge resources if folks are interested in continuing their learning journey.
That's awesome. I know that, there are some discouraging and frightening stats when it comes to LGBTQ youth in terms of being abused, being targeted, being bullied, all of those things. And, as you said, that's not the world we want to be living in.
Yeah, absolutely. We know that, unfortunately, LGBTQ plus youth are disproportionately represented in unhoused populations in the juvenile justice system, in juvenile detention, as well as are more likely to be exploited or placed into systems of prostitution. So there are some ugly and scary stats that we're combating. And also within the foster care system, finding placement for LGBTQ plus youth that are safe homes is really challenging as well. And so if folks are connected to these systems or are work within these service providers, being vocal advocates for trainings, for identifying how to best place and provide resources for young queer folks is such a critical need.
That is definitely something that's always struck me that, we talked a little bit about racism. With this form of oppression, you really don't get to take for granted that your family is your ally in this. And the fact that so many young people are rejected by their own parents is just unfathomably painful to me.
Yeah, and on the therapy note piece, and I think this is really important and something that I've had to navigate myself, which is extremely difficult, is when you need to set boundaries for the relationships in your life to protect yourself, is something that's very, very difficult because the role of shame and, I grew up with the notion that blood is thicker than water, that idiom of like, there's always family, like friends and everything they leave, but family's always there. And I have not had that be proven, in some of my own life experiences. And chosen family is extremely real. It is very valid. If you truly care about people and your relationships with them, you can form these familial bonds of people that you are not related to. And that's a really difficult thing to do because a lot of it for myself navigating parent dynamics is extremely hard because for my own, and again, I'll make this personal and speak for myself, the love feeling is there, the love action is not. And it is an extremely difficult thing to navigate because I'm constantly made to feel like I'm the one limiting the family relationship because I am choosing to dress this way, I'm choosing to identify this way. And why wouldn't it just be easier if I, threw on a pair of jeans and a t-shirt and came home for Thanksgiving? Like, is that so much to ask? And that's the layers, right? That's the layering of this. It's like, you don't realize you're not just asking for me to dress differently. You're asking for me to leave behind and hide a part of my identity that I literally had to fight to survive, to represent and to be. And I represent myself so fully now in the world. And I want young people to see that. I believe visibility is so important. And I don't want to play nice and talk about the weather when I'm sitting near my niece who's growing up in a world that looks really similar to mine almost 30 years later, which is scary. I know what I went through in that environment. And I don't want this young person to go through and survive what I had to survive. And so there's a disconnect there between what family feels is like, oh, just do this for the family, and what I have to hold as like what I feel to be a strong moral obligation to young people in the world to authentically be myself, despite the impact that that has on family relationship.
I'm so glad you said that. I'm sure that there's so much pressure when you decide that you're going to disconnect from a family. People that love you don't necessarily understand or validate and it clearly is what you have to do in situations where where that's being asked of you. Wow. Other people have thoughts, comments, questions, things they wanted to bring to Josh, who has so kindly opened himself up to talk about this and to talk about this experience. I'm so glad that you have that you bring the religious element into the conversation, because I do find that that's one validation people use for the oppression. And that, to me, honestly, that is the reason why I have not participated in organized religion. I feel like if they're sanctioning oppression in any way, shape, or form, that is not a space I want to be in. That has, clearly that was a big central in your life, the religious aspect that people put onto this as a moral choice somehow.
Yeah. And I have recognized and navigated my own upset and frustration with religion in ways that was very difficult to navigate. And I was very opposed and anti-religion for many, many years. And I still do not identify personally as religious. And again, more on the spiritual, connected to energy, nature, and other people type of existence. But I also now have folks in my life who are queer and are ministers and are part of faith communities that do uplift and support and affirm the identities of individuals. And, I can mostly only speak from like the Christianity, vantage point. I grew up conservative Baptist primarily. And so I'm very familiar with the Bible from, Genesis to Revelation, and was always a master at my sword drills when I was in elementary school, which for those unfamiliar is who could find the Bible verse the fastest. And so I have a lot of that knowledge, which has been helpful as in my dialogue with folks around if you want to engage in a conversation around the teachings of Jesus, which is the focus of primarily the Protestant and Catholic faith versions of Christianity, the oppression and the lack of acceptance and love that we see in how people behave and how people vote is antithetical to the teachings of Christ. Right. And that is something that I ask people to really grapple with, because contradictions present themselves when you're creating an environment in a society which literally is and statistically proven to leading to increased amount of self-harm and suicide of young people, which is increasing the lack of ability for people to pursue and receive their own and make their own decisions about their health and body. There are a lot of things that really need to be challenged. And so I encourage people, when they use the defense of religion, to really think about how much of what you're defending is social construction and actually faith, because that's another thing that I've had thrown at me as you're this way because you're not religious. You don't have, God or whatever, faith deity, insert faith deity here. You don't have that person or that being. So that's why you're living in this sin. And I'll mention that we recently had Pride Worcester a couple weeks ago in downtown, and we had some fundamentalist evangelists who were standing right in the center of the happy parade of people walking through to all these different tents and booths. yelling at young kids that they were sinners. And I had to have this altercation with this person and say, like, do you recognize that what you are doing is not spreading love? It's not spreading this message that you feel is what needs to reach people. You are literally traumatizing these young people who came downtown to this space to find space where they could feel safe, and you are fracturing that completely. And that is still what we are fighting against in 2021. And unfortunately, we have seen a rise in LGBTQ hate and discrimination since the past administration. We have seen a justification for voting against the rights of trans people. We've seen these policies and this legislation filed across the country that is looking to completely eliminate and erase young trans kids from participating in sports at school or accessing bathrooms or accessing healthcare. And when we talk about the social justice work that we're all involved in, the LGBTQ plus matters affect women's matters. All of these things are connected. Healthcare as a right needs to be protected and defended. And we can still, and Worcester is not exempt from this. I cannot confidently walk into every doctor's office and know that I'm going to receive the support that I need. And that is something that is so crucial. It's we need to not only change how people think about and talk about these issues, we need to change the curriculum that is educating the people who are becoming doctors, who are becoming teachers, who are becoming lawyers and policymakers and politicians, so that their mindset going into this work is support and affirmation of folks who have been living at the margins for generations.
Anyone else want to jump in? Questions, thoughts, things that we did cover a lot. We really did, Josh. Very well done. I think I told you before, there's a documentary called Because the Bible Tells Me So. And I get choked up even just thinking about it. But the woman made the documentary after she rejected her daughter for coming out as a lesbian. Her daughter died by suicide. And she was left feeling very abandoned by religion. Why did you tell me this? And now I lost my daughter. And the documentary was her going to different religious officials saying, where did this come from? Why is it this way? Why have we what is this about? And as you said, it's really clear that is not what Jesus would do.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's so many, and this is where it's, I could have gone down a pathway of saying all right, I'm going to prove that the Bible doesn't actually say this. And a lot of people have gone down that pathway. That's not my journey. I'm glad there are people doing that work, talking about the translation and things that were omitted or not included in the Bible when it was printed. There's a whole dialogue within that specific faith community, which I'm glad that people do that work. But I also live in a space where I want, if we're truly looking at existing in a diverse society that accepts and embraces varying cultures and beliefs, there are levels in which beliefs crash, right? And so how do we justify that? One of the quotes that I use in a lot of my work is from James Baldwin, and I'm sure I'm paraphrasing this, but it's we can disagree and still love each other as long as that disagreement is not rooted in my oppression, right? And that is an extremely powerful thing to bring forward, because in a lot of these conversations, I'll again say with my family, with people in my family, it is well, we just believe something different, so we just need to agree to disagree. And I'm unfortunately, your belief is limiting my access to human rights. So I can't just sit down at a dinner table and be oh yeah, let's forget about the fact that mom and dad voted against my right to marry. Let's ignore that. No, we can't ignore that when I and other people like me are being oppressed by the decisions made at the people I'm sitting at dinner with. And that is the space where more conversations that are disagreeable and uncomfortable need to be had, because people are in the confines of a family social dynamic and like this family obligation to be like, all right, we got to sit there. We're going to have these conversations. There's space for argument. And obviously people need to make their own decisions about how, like, their level of safety and like all of that. I want to underscore that as well. And also just note that there are so many missed opportunities because of being like, oh, I just don't want to get into this right now. And sometimes for marginalized folks, we deserve a time. We deserve a break sometimes, right? We deserve that break. And it's sometimes can be exhausting, and being known as the like, oh, if we invite Josh to this, we know that something's going to be an issue. And it's like, let's address the fact, like, let's talk about why that is, you know. It's like, yeah, so I'm rambling now at this point, but more uncomfortable discussion needs to happen at dinner tables, in my opinion.
And, you know, and Josh, but you're not really rambling, because that's the thing. The person who is marginalized gets identified as the problem, right? Not the system that marginalized them. They're the problem. And the way you just talked about that makes that so clear, that belief that rather than look at why we're shoving people to the side here, well, because they're problems, right? Like I've definitely become much more aware of how much we sign on to people's oppression because we do not want to change our own behaviors, and we don't want to look at ourselves because it's painful to see the ways that you've contributed to harm. It's real painful, but if you don't, it's the unseen pattern and you just keep doing the harm. And
That's right.
I don't want to be doing harm. And I know that people are here today because they care enough to want to be the best they can for young people and people of all ages. There's still challenges to being your full self, whatever age you are in this culture. We really aren't.
Absolutely. Well,
where we want to be.
Yeah, well, and that's why one of my biggest things is the constant pursuit of learning. If we're constantly open to learning and exploring and understanding different vantage points and perspectives, I feel like that's how we create a society that is constantly able to evolve and grow. And if we set some baseline tenets and like beliefs that everybody is worthy of love, respect, and affirmation, like, and start there, we would have a much more beautiful and functioning society.
So well put. Any other thoughts, comments, questions? I know people really, really appreciated your willingness to sort of share your story and share yourself. And doing work about trauma, I hate to have people sort of put their pain out there. Right? That's kind of yucky, but I feel like when we see the pain that we're causing, it hopefully becomes a reason to change, right? That, like, what could be a better motivator for change than that? But it does. It's not easy to allow yourself to have your pain on display. And it's so appreciated. And I know you come to it with the spirit of learning and open-mindedness and really wanting people to understand what this is like, and what the possibilities could be. And so I just so much appreciate all that you do, not just in this realm, but in all the social justice realms. I very much appreciate you don't pick and choose issues, and you show up for oppression more that you're on the privileged side of. It's really important, as you said, for all of us to have allies and to be allies. The pitting us against each other stuff has been working really well.
It sure
and
has.
Can't let that continue to be the way we do it.
Yep. I know someone, I think it might have been you actually on a call that mentioned like the oppression Olympics and how it's like this, like, oh, let's put all the folks that are being harmed by society and let's like architect how we can make them fight against each other. And we see how that shows up. And I could go on a whole nother hour-long conversation about the nonprofit industrial complex and how like we control social movement by disallowing and allowing certain folks access to funding and money. And we still see folks at the margins fighting for even recognition, never mind funding, for the work that they're doing to change systems inherently. And this is where, a lot of the work that I do in my consulting job is looking at reimagining systems, not reforming, reimagination of systems. Like I'm working with DYS right now, and I'll do a quick plug on October 6th. DYS, in partnership with Citizens for Juvenile Justice, DESE, and some other organizations like the Education Trust, are doing a summit on eliminating the school to prison pipeline called Reimagining School Climate. And that's on October 6th. Folks can find it on Eventbrite. I can maybe try and find it real quick to drop in the chat, but it's really looking at how do we reimagine a youth justice system that is anti-racist, developmentally appropriate to the age of the child, and truly transformative in its approach to justice. And that requires a total rethinking of how we build and construct systems. And it is something that so many folks feel is completely out of the realm of possibility, but it's also because a lot of the folks that work and benefit from the systems as how they are put in place, it makes more sense to try and push the slow reform approach instead of being like, actually, there's a better way to do this. So let's do it. Let's build it that way.
That's going to be next month. So look for an invitation. I'm hoping to bring back a lot of people that have presented to really reflect on this idea of systems change and how can we create systems that aren't traumatizing people? Because it's been, like 2 years of looking at all the harm we do to people. And I'm not okay with just sitting with that and not helping to move it. And I know that I got a good partner in you and in many of the other people that have helped us in understanding trauma in new ways. The hurt people are the ones who really show up. I love that. It's another argument for resilience, right? Like when you come out the other side of the hurt, you're an advocate, you're an ally, you're not going to be okay with continuing at status quo.
Yeah, and I think part of it, and maybe this is, to try and find advantage in that hurt. I think for folks who have experienced some harm and otherness, we exist closer to tapping into empathy. And I think that is something that is so critical in society. And it's a conversation that I've had with a lot of people about, like, how do we teach empathy? How do we really grow and build to drive decisions in more empathetic ways? And that is a question that maybe for another conversation, but really, like, how do we tap into the, like, humans caring for other humans as a baseline, right? And shed everything else, which sounds way easier than we know it to actually be.
Right. Should be as easy as it sounds, but it isn't. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. So grateful that people care enough to continue to show up and learn about the experiences of other people. It really is beautiful. It makes me love this community, and I'm so glad you landed here in Worcester, Joshua.
Thank you, Amy. I'm glad to be here.
All right. Thanks again, everyone. And I'll get out resources to people. I'll post anything you want on our page as well, our Facebook page, and we'll make sure people have, can get the resources. Hans has had enough, Josh. He's jumping on me right now. I was thinking that. I'm like, Josh has known Hans his whole life, and Hans knows you.
I know, through screen, but
through his screen, but he knows. All right. Thanks again, Josh. So appreciate it.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you, everybody.